My name is Kara. I'm 29 years old, and the last time my family invited me to our annual photo shoot, my sister screamed at me in front of everyone. We were standing in the courtyard of this fancy resort they'd rented for a big reunion. The photographer was trying to line us up. People were fixing their hair, straightening shirts, doing that fake laugh they always do when a camera is around. I was just trying to find a spot where I wouldn't be in anyone's way. Then my sister's voice cut through everything. "Get out of the frame. You're ruining everything." For a second, I honestly thought she was talking to someone else. The whole courtyard went quiet. The photographer froze. A couple of relatives looked down at their shoes like suddenly the ground got interesting. My dad didn't even turn around. He just said, "Yeah, kick her out." Nobody asked why. Nobody told him that was too much. No one even touched my arm or met my eyes. It was like everybody had been waiting for that moment. And now that it happened, the safest thing they could do was pretend I wasn't there. My chest was burning, but I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stepped back from the group, smoothed my shirt like I was the one who had decided to move, and I smiled as I walked away from the camera and out of the courtyard. They thought that was the end of it. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. He Resort wasn't the first time my family turned a picture into a performance. It was just the first time they did it to my face. Growing up, our annual photo was treated like a holiday my parents cared about more than any actual holiday. My older sister Marissa always stood in the middle, always in the best outfit, always with the kind of smile that looked like it had been practiced in the mirror. I was the one they shifted to the edge of the frame, the one they told to scoot over a bit so someone else could fit. By the time we booked the reunion at the resort, the whole thing had turned into a production. Marissa had a mood board for outfits, a shared folder with pose ideas, and a list of angles that flatter the family. She sent it to everyone like it was a work memo. My mom, Denise, called me just once about it, not to ask how I felt, just to remind me what color I was supposed to wear so I wouldn't throw things off. That was the pattern. Marissa curated, Dad enforced, Mom smoothed it over, and I adapted. When I was a teenager, it was Marissa telling me not to wear my glasses in photos because they caught the light wrong. In college, it was Dad telling me not to dye my hair because it made the family look messy. When I started working in a field they did not understand, they decided the safest thing was to act like my job barely existed. The weird part is they still leaned on me whenever things got complicated. I was the one who read the fine print when somebody signed a contract without looking. I was the one who sorted out billing errors, reservation mistakes, and long emails from vendors nobody else had the patience to read. If something needed to be untangled quietly, it landed in my inbox sooner or later. They never called it responsibility. They called it a favor. Marissa would text me a screenshot and write, "Can you just fix this?" Dad would forward me an email chain with a single line at the top. "Look into this for us." Mom would say thank you in a small, guilty voice, then change the subject before I could say how much time it took. So when Marissa shrieked at me in front of everybody at the resort, it wasn't some random outburst. It was the loudest version of a message they had been sending me for years. You do the work in the background and you disappear when the camera comes out. Standing there in that courtyard, watching them rearrange themselves around the empty space where I had been, I realized something I probably should have understood a long time ago. They wanted the parts of me that were useful and invisible. The rest of me, the part that wanted to simply exist in the picture, had always been a problem they were waiting for the right moment to cut out. Uncle Walter was the one who started the reunion tradition years ago, back when it was just a cookout and a disposable camera on a plastic table. He used to say photos were how you remembered who you were. Somewhere along the way, Marissa and Dad turned that into photos are how you prove who you are. The resort was their latest proof. It cost enough for Dad to brag and looked polished enough for Marissa to post without anything in the background, giving away that we were still just a regular family. Her fiancé, Austin, said the whole thing was great for the brand, like our relatives were props, and I was a defective piece still on the shelf. The only reason they had picked that resort and locked in the dates was because I handled the parts nobody else wanted. I compared rates, read cancellation policies, sat on hold when the system glitched, signed the paperwork, and kept track of every confirmation number. A few days before we left, Mom asked if I was excited. I said I was mostly tired. She gave a small laugh and told me not to overthink it, that once the photos were done, everyone would calm down. She was wrong. The photos weren't the end of anything. They were the start of the part where my family finally made it clear they only wanted me in the story if I stayed behind the camera, holding everything together where nobody had to see me. In the weeks after the resort trip, the silence between us felt heavier than anything that had actually been said in that courtyard. Nobody called to ask why I walked away from the photo. The family group chat kept lighting up with pictures from the weekend, but I was just a viewer, never a part of it. Then, one afternoon, the notifications stopped. When I opened my phone, the chat was gone. Not muted, not archived, just not there anymore. It took me a minute to understand what that meant. I scrolled through my messages, trying to convince myself I had hit the wrong button. Then I saw a new chat with almost the same name. They had created a fresh thread and added everyone but me. My mother sent a separate text that evening, a few words asking if I had made it home safely. There was no mention of the courtyard, no mention of my sister shouting, no mention of my father agreeing to erase me from the frame. I typed and erased 3 different replies before settling on, "Yeah, I'm fine." She heart-reacted it and never followed up. That became the new rhythm. I stopped hearing about birthdays and cookouts from my family and started seeing them as background noise on my feed. There they were at a barbecue, all matching shirts again, only this time the photo looked uncrowded. There they were at a bridal shower for my sister, smiling in front of a balloon arch, while her fiancé held a plastic champagne flute. I was not tagged. I was not even mentioned in the comments when some distant relative asked where I was. What did find its way to me were the problems. The first email came from the resort. A billing discrepancy on the final invoice, something about the room block and an extra cleaning fee. The email was addressed to me because my name was on the paperwork. I had been the one who read the terms, put down the card, and signed as the primary contact. I forwarded the message to my father with a short note saying the resort had a question. He replied with one line, asking me to take care of it like I always did. A few days later, a photographer the family used every year sent a polite message. He had uploaded the edited gallery, but the payment on file had bounced. For some reason, he reached out to me instead of my parents. Maybe he was used to me cleaning things up. Maybe my email address was simply the only one he trusted to answer. I forwarded that one, too, this time to my mother, suggesting she call him back. She thanked me, said she had no idea there was an issue, and added that the photos turned out beautiful and that my sister was thrilled with them. I did not ask to see them. I could picture the group lined up without opening a single file. Little by little, the pattern sharpened. If there was a bill somebody did not want to talk about, it landed in my inbox. If there was a contract clause nobody had bothered to read, I was the one who saw the consequences. If there was confusion over dates, policies, or signatures, the vendors somehow found their way back to me. At some point, I stopped being surprised when another unfamiliar address appeared in my inbox. Meanwhile, the personal side of things dried up. No invitations, no casual calls, no quiet messages. It was like they had split me in half. The version of me who existed as a person had been quietly cut out of the picture, but the version of me who existed as a name on documents was still very much in use. I wish I could say I saw all of this clearly from the beginning. The truth is, I went along with it at first. I answered questions. I clarified terms. I called customer service and waited on hold, because that was what I had always done. It took more than a few invoices and more than a few carefully worded texts from my parents before something in me shifted from hurt to tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the deep kind that comes from realizing people will keep using you as long as you let them. By the time the next wave of problems hit, I had stopped assuming it was my job to make them disappear. His shift started with one email I did not answer the way I used to. It came from a vendor my father worked with through his small company, a name I knew from nights helping him sort contracts at the kitchen table. There was a dispute about an invoice and a note saying my email was listed as the primary contact. The attached agreement put it in writing, my name on the signature line, my address underneath, my inbox as the place where problems were supposed to land. Before that, I would have handled it without thinking. Read the terms, call the number, sit on hold, smooth it out, and send my father a message saying everything was fixed. This time, I forwarded the email to him and wrote that the vendor had a question about his account and that he would need to respond directly. I did not offer to call. I did not explain the contract. He answered a few hours later, asking if I could just take care of it, like usual, because he was busy and did not want to say the wrong thing. The old reflex flared up. Then I wrote back that I was no longer managing communication for his business and that the agreement listed his name as well. If he had questions, he could ask the vendor himself. His next message was shorter. He said I was being ungrateful and that the least I could do was make a phone call when he asked. I put my phone face down on the table and let it buzz on its own. That decision changed the way I read every message after that. I created a folder in my email labeled Family and started dropping anything that did not belong to me into it. Hotel confirmations with my address, invoices tied to cards I did not control, notices from vendors who had my contact from some event years ago. Instead of fixing the problem, I forwarded each message to the person whose name was on it with a simple line. This is yours. Here is the information. You will need to reply. My mother called a few evenings later, using the tone she saved for conversations that might turn into conflict. She asked if things were all right between me and my father. I said they were the same as they had always been. She hesitated, then mentioned that he was stressed about paperwork stuff and that it would help him if I stepped in. I told her I was tired of being the person they only reached for when something needed fixing. I said if Dad wanted help, he could call me himself, and that even then I would decide based on whether he was ready to take responsibility, not on how badly he wanted to hand it off. She went quiet, then shifted to small talk. Marissa reached out after that, not with an apology, but with screenshots from a contract for a new event she was planning. There were highlighted sections about cancellation fees and liability. At the bottom, she wrote that she knew I was good at this and that she needed an answer by the end of the day. I looked at the screenshots, then typed one question. Was the agreement in her name? When she said yes, I told her she needed to contact the organizer or hire someone whose job was to interpret those terms. I added one line saying that my role in the family was not running a free help desk. She did not respond. Once I stopped automatically stepping in, the cracks in their system showed. Dates they thought were confirmed turned out to be tentative. Payments they assumed had gone through showed up as overdue notices. Policies they had never bothered to read closed doors they thought would always be open. On my side, life got quieter. I went to work, did the job I was paid for, and came home. I answered messages with my name on them and left everyone else to answer their own. The only thing that started falling apart was the idea that my family could sign anything, ignore everything, and expect me to absorb the fallout. The more distance I put between myself and their mess, the clearer it became that they had built a routine around my automatic yes. My signature made their plans possible, and my silence let them pretend it all just worked. By the time the next problem landed, it did not come to me behind the scenes. It arrived in front of them with no one standing in the way. When the busy season rolled around, the gap I left stopped being invisible. My father's company always had a rush in late spring. Clients renewed contracts, scheduled events, and expected confirmations within days. In other years, that meant frantic calls, my father pacing with a stack of papers while I sorted through clauses and emails. This time, the calls did not come, but the problems still did. I heard about the first one from my cousin Lenora, who worked part-time in my father's office. One afternoon, she texted me during her break, saying the front desk was getting flooded with calls from a client who thought they had a guaranteed date that was suddenly pending review. I asked one question: who had signed the agreement? She sent a picture of the signature line with my father's name. A few days later, she told me another client had shown up to ask why their deposit had been applied to the wrong invoice. There was a copy of the contract in the folder, but no one could explain the gap between what had been promised and what was written down. In the past, my father would have dropped the folder on my desk and told me to make it line up. Now he was in the lobby trying to explain himself to people who were used to smooth answers. I stayed out of it. I listened to Lenora vent, then reminded her none of it was her responsibility. She was a receptionist, not a shield. The trouble did not stay in the office. Marissa had picked that same season to ramp up planning for a string of events tied to her engagement. There were dress appointments, showers, a rehearsal dinner, and a separate content day her fiancé, Austin, kept hyping up like a campaign. Every piece of it required bookings, deposits, and policies in fine print. Without someone translating the fine print, the mistakes multiplied. A venue they thought was fully reserved turned out to still be holding the date open. A photographer they assumed was secured sent a polite message saying he had never received a retainer. A catering company asked for confirmation on headcount and menu by a deadline that had already passed. I watched pieces of this from the outside. Social media posts went from confident announcements to vague captions about details in progress. My mother left voicemails that never quite said what was wrong, only that things were complicated and that everyone was on edge. Then one evening, Austin showed up in my inbox. He sent a careful email from his work address, saying he understood I had experience with contracts and logistics, and that the family had relied on me in the past. He wrote that some of their plans were in flux, and that he hoped I could straighten out a few misunderstandings with vendors before things spiraled. A year earlier, I would have taken that as my cue to dive in. This time, I read every line twice and noticed how carefully he kept the responsibility vague. He framed it as if a neutral third party had simply been missing, and I was being invited in as a professional favor. I replied with 2 sentences. I told him I did not provide unpaid consulting for family matters, and that any agreements already signed were between the signers and the companies involved. I suggested he review the documents with whoever had put their name on them or hire someone whose job it was to handle that kind of work. He waited a day, then sent a shorter message saying he respected my boundaries, but that things were getting messy fast. I did not answer. The next sign that the mess had reached my parents came from the one person who almost never called directly. My father's number lit up my phone on a Tuesday morning while I was at my own job. In the past, I would have stepped out and answered immediately. Instead, I let it ring into voicemail. He did not leave a message the first time. He called again that night and finally spoke into the line. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. He said there were misunderstandings with a few contracts, that some of the vendors were being difficult, and that he needed me to walk him through what had gone wrong. He never used the word help, he used the word fix. I listened to the message once, then deleted it. I had already shown them what it looked like when I stopped patching the cracks. Now the cracks were beginning to show themselves to everyone else. Almost a year after the reunion at the resort, my family finally asked to see me face to face. The invitation came from my mother. She called on a Thursday night and sounded like she was reading off a card. She said Uncle Walter wanted to host a small dinner and thought it would be good if we were all in the same room again. She said it like the last year had been a scheduling issue, not the result of everyone watching me get pushed out of the picture and choosing to stay quiet. I asked her what the dinner was really about. She said it was to clear the air and talk things through. When I asked whether that meant how they had treated me, or the fact that clients and vendors were suddenly upset with them, she hesitated just long enough to answer both questions. Then she said it was a little bit of everything, which really meant they needed something from me and did not know how to ask directly. I agreed with conditions. We would not meet at my parents' house or at my sister's condo. If they wanted to talk, we would do it in Uncle Walter's living room, with him sitting there the whole time, and I would leave the second it turned into another speech about loyalty. My mother rushed to say yes, sounding more relieved than happy, like she had been holding her breath waiting for me to refuse. In the days before the dinner, I did something I had never done before. I opened my laptop and went back through the year they kept pretending was mysterious. I pulled emails from resorts, photographers, and vendors who had my address because someone in my family wrote it on their forms. Notices about declined cards, reminders about overdue balances, threads where I had forwarded problems back to the people who signed everything. Mixed into those threads were short replies from my father telling me to handle it, and long messages from my sister acting like I was a free assistant. None of them used the word responsibility. It was always framed as a favor, as something I would obviously take care of because I was good with details. I printed the messages that showed that pattern and slid the pages into a thin folder I left by the door. Uncle Walter's house looked the way it always had. Same framed photos, same soft lamp in the corner. My mother opened the door and hugged me quickly, then stepped aside. My father gave me a short nod from the hallway. Marissa sat at the far end of the couch with her arms crossed. Austin was beside her, too stiff to look relaxed. Uncle Walter stayed in his usual armchair, one hand resting on the armrest, watching everyone come to a stop. He did not say much at first. He did not have to. The way he looked from one face to another made it clear that this was not just a casual meal, and that he knew it. We got through a few minutes of small talk about work and traffic. Nobody mentioned the courtyard at the resort. Nobody mentioned the group chat that had quietly reappeared without me in it. Then my father leaned forward, braced his elbows on his knees, and said we needed to clear the air. The way the room tightened told me everyone knew this was the real agenda. He started with his business. He said clients had been confused, vendors difficult, schedules falling apart. He said this year had been harder than it needed to be. Then he shifted to reputation, to how people were starting to talk, to how the family did not look put together anymore. He said he knew I had pulled back, and that he respected my feelings, but that the way I had stepped away was damaging the family. When he ran out of phrases, Marissa took over. She said planning her engagement party and showers had been a nightmare, that dates slipped, that companies had let her down, that nothing was simple anymore. She said things used to run smoothly when I was more available, like I had taken a break from a job instead of walking away from being used. She never said my name, but every sentence still pointed at me. I let the room go quiet, then set the folder on the coffee table. I told them I had brought something to make things clearer. I opened it and laid out a short row of pages, the resort contract with my email listed as contact, a notice from the photographer about a declined card in my father's name, a vendor message addressed to me about an agreement my sister had signed, and copies of my replies sending each issue back to them. My voice stayed level while I talked. I said I had not sabotaged anything. I had just stopped standing between them and the outcome of their own signatures. Uncle Walter leaned in, read the names on the pages, and asked my father and my sister to confirm which ones were theirs. When they did, he said calmly that I had a right to step back, and that if everything fell apart without me, the problem was never my boundary. It was theirs. 2 years passed before anyone in my family even hinted at how badly things had unraveled. By then, my life was small and steady. I woke up in an apartment I paid for myself, not a guest room in someone else's house. The photos on my walls were of people who invited me in without asking for anything in return. When my phone buzzed, it was coworkers and friends using my name, not relatives dropping problems in my lap. I still heard about my family through Lenora. She mentioned things in passing when we met for coffee, more like weather reports than gossip. She said my father's office felt tense now. Assistants came and went. Clients stopped signing every document he slid across the desk and started asking questions he could not answer because no one had explained the fine print to him first. Without a quiet buffer, his habit of overpromising showed. On my sister's side, the polished life she curated online started to buckle. The engagement that once looked like a nonstop celebration turned into a list of events that never quite happened. Deposits disappeared into contracts she did not really understand. Vendors stopped being flexible because there was no one smoothing misunderstandings behind the scenes. The brand Marissa had built on flawless images began to crack in places that could not be edited out. I was not there when Austin decided he was tired of living inside a performance. All I heard was that he pushed for fewer staged moments and more real time, and that Marissa did not know who she was without a backdrop. At some point, the wedding was not postponed anymore. It was gone. The save the dates came down, and nothing replaced them. My parents tried to keep the rest of the family structure upright. Holidays shrank into smaller meals. Reunions turned into a single afternoon instead of a weekend. Relatives who used to travel for every milestone now visited on their own schedules, without waiting for my parents to organize anything. No one suggested another trip to the resort. Officially, it was too expensive. Quietly, everyone knew there was no energy left to hold that image together. I still saw Uncle Walter some Sundays. We sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about neighbors, gas prices, and the small changes that mark time when life is ordinary. He did not ask me to fix anything. He had watched me draw a line in his living room and took it seriously. When he mentioned my parents, it was only to say they were working through things. Then he would change the subject. From him, I heard that the weeks after that night were loud at their house. My father said he had been blindsided. Marissa said no one appreciated the pressure she was under. My mother tried to smooth it all until she was worn out. Uncle Walter answered each of them the same way. They had built their comfort on the idea that I would always be there. And what hurt them most was finding out that idea was not true. They adjusted just enough to stumble forward without me, but not enough to see me as anything other than a missing tool. In their minds, I was still available, just temporarily out of reach. I stayed out of the way on purpose. I went to work, paid my bills, and let my days be shaped by people who looked me in the eye when they asked for help. I answered calls from friends who wanted to share news, not just emergencies. When an unknown number popped up late at night, I watched it go to voicemail and felt my shoulders stay loose. Over time, the messages I ignored changed. My mother started with little things: a picture of a pie she baked, a blurry photo of the dog on the couch, a line asking how I was doing. When I did not answer, the texts got longer. She wrote that the house felt strange, that dinners were quiet, that she missed hearing me in the hallway. She never wrote the word sorry. She never mentioned the day she stared at the ground while my father agreed the photo would look better without me. My father moved from stiff emails about contracts to careful voicemails. He talked about family and time and not letting one bad day erase everything. He said life was short. He said mistakes had been made on both sides. He never named the sentence he had thrown over his shoulder in the courtyard as the photographer waited for me to move. Marissa waited the longest. When her message finally came, it read like a closing argument delivered to an empty room. She wrote that the last 2 years had been brutal, that people had stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt, that nothing she planned stayed intact. Somewhere in the middle, she said she regretted how things went that day. At the end, she said she wanted to move forward and asked what it would take. They each named pressure, stress, fallout, timing. None of them named the choice. By the time their messages turned into, "We will do anything if you come back," the feeling inside me had changed. It was not the raw sting from the drive home after the resort. It was a clear line between their story and my life, and I had already decided which side I was on. 2 years is long enough to learn what it feels like to belong to yourself. In that time, I sat at tables where nobody worried about whether I ruined a picture, because there was no picture. Just people happy I showed up. I practiced saying no without building a defense. I stopped treating my ability to absorb chaos as proof that I deserved to stay. So when my phone filled with their calls and long paragraphs, I let them sit. I did not reply. I did not walk back into a role I had already walked out of. The consequence of their decision was not my anger. It was my absence. If there is anything I hope you carry from this, it is that being pushed out of the frame hurts. But staying in a family that only wants the useful parts of you hurts longer. A boundary is not revenge. It is a decision about what you refuse to keep carrying for people who will not see you clearly. My boundary cost my family the fantasy that I would always be there, no matter how small they tried to make me. It gave me back a life where I am allowed to stand where I choose, even if that means I stand alone. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you for listening. I hope my story makes you look at your own place in whatever picture you grew up in and ask whether it really fits you. If you feel like it, tell me in the comments what part of this hit you the most or what it reminded you of. And honestly, thank you for spending your time here with me.